You're listening to the Sass Says podcast. I'm your host, Christy Rocha, also known as Sass. I identify as a woman, a wife, and a mother. That should tell you a lot already. And over the last few years, I've learned the value of talk therapy. I have seen how my inner work not only enhances my own well-being, but also my marriage, my parenting, my relationships. And in fact, you wouldn't be hearing this right now if it weren't for the work I've done. My mission is to debunk the misconceptions and stigmas around what therapy is and who it's for. Let's normalize working on our mental health and seeking help when needed. We've all heard of self-care, self-help, and self-love, but do you often wonder how to actually make it all happen? I do. You'll hear strategy-based conversations with professionals, as well as inspiring and validating stories from women who are just like you and me. Think of this podcast as the weekly therapy sessions you didn't know you needed, with a dash of sass, a lot of vulnerability, and me, relentlessly asking, but how? Hello. Okay, I have an interview for you today. I know that's exciting. My guest today is Michelle Tangeman. She is a child and family therapist, creator of Thriving Toddler, co-host of the Parenting Understood podcast, and a mom of two. Michelle has extensive experience in individualized behavior intervention, functional behavior assessments, school-based services, family-focused intervention, early start services, and social skills training, and has provided these services to families across Ventura and Los Angeles counties. Michelle has also completed the training as part of the Postpartum Support International's Advanced Perinatal Mental Health Psychotherapy Training Program. It's a very important thing. It's very long. Her online education company, Thriving Toddler, offers courses and free resources aimed to help as many people as possible become the parents they want to be. All right, so before we get into this conversation, I want to share a few things. Number one, I want to offer a trigger warning for abuse, childhood trauma. And number two, today Michelle vulnerably shares some of her childhood, specifically around the trauma, for the first time. So some portions of the conversation were edited to protect her and her family's privacy. And although I think the conversation flows very seamlessly, I don't think these edits take away from the point of Michelle's story or the context at all. There may be a time or two where the audio feels like it maybe doesn't quite flow. Just want to give you a heads up. Anyway, this is a really powerful conversation. I'm so glad you're here. Here's Michelle. Hey, Michelle. So nice to meet you. Thank you for being here with me today.
So nice to meet you. I'm so happy to be here today.
I have followed your account on Instagram for a long time, so this is like very cool seeing you in the flesh.
Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you to say. Sometimes I wonder, like I'm producing content, I'm wondering who's listening, who's
Oh my God.
watching.
Yeah, it's like you're sending stuff out into a black hole. It's like, who's
Yeah,
there? I
yeah,
know that
for
feeling
sure.
so well.
It's
Yeah.
a one-way, for the most part, it feels like a one-way relationship, right?
Yep.
And sometimes I get some feedback, which is great, but most of the time I don't.
Yep. I say that all the time, and I don't have nearly the platform that you have, but it's like I can only imagine at that next level of just spending the amount of time that you do putting stuff out there. And well, I'll tell you, like, at least me, like, there are people like me who consume it all the time and like when we can and comment when we can, but there are more people watching than I think are letting you know
Oh, I
that they're
appreciate that.
watching.
Thank you. Yeah. Helps me
Um,
keep it going.
yeah, you need it. You need it.
Mhm, mhm.
Totally. I had that conversation with someone. It was about, I think, my Enneagram. And
Mm.
it was the first time I had clarity on the fact that, like, it's in my personality type to to want the likes and the comments and all of
Mm.
that. And I just was like, okay, I'm gonna stop feeling bad about this. Like,
Yeah,
sure, I want to help people, but I also want to know I'm helping people.
for sure. You want that feedback. We're
Yeah.
designed that way.
Yeah. Totally. Okay. All right. So we'll get into more of that later
Mhm.
if we have time.
Yes, yes.
I'd like to start out as I usually do, learning a little bit about you and why you became a therapist and got into this field to begin with.
Yeah, so I know I kind of shared this with you before we started recording, but I just want to say it to everybody out there that's listening. And then this is the first time I'm really sharing, kind of going a little bit deeper into myself and sharing publicly kind of why I started in mental health.
Mhm.
And so I may fumble a little bit through this, but I'm choosing to be brave and have the courage to kind of share because it's a big part of who I am and it's my story and it's led me to this point in my life. And if anything, I hope that this story, you know, it will, kind of stand out to somebody and say, oh, okay, like inspired them in some way or help them in some way. And if it's just that one person, I'm totally, totally happy with that. So,
Mhm.
okay, so the question is how did I get into mental health? Let's start there.
Yes.
Um, so to understand me, you have to understand what happened the first 6 years of my life.
Mm.
And we know in terms of child development that those first, like really 3 years are really, really important, right? And so even 3 year, 5 year. So the first 6 years, really important in human development. And at that time in my life, there was a lot of chaos around me in that I had a family, an entire family that had immigrated from a different country. So the stress of immigration, living in under one roof.
Mhm.
And the other piece with this of this is I had a caregiver that has a severe mental illness, specifically schizophrenia. And
Oh,
so
wow.
I was living in an environment that intermittently felt chaos. It wasn't chaotic all of the time,
Mhm.
but just the fact that it was consistently um, unpredictable at times, and I wasn't sure like what to expect. There was a lot of verbal abuse. There was a lot of physical abuse that I witnessed firsthand. And, that's really scary as a little person. You have no idea how to interpret that. And really, I think looking back on my entire childhood, I think the biggest thing was is that nobody ever explained to me
Mm.
like what mental illness was. Nobody ever sat down and explained to me like what was happening in my environment. And so I was really, really left on my own to figure it out. And
Mm.
and I'm an only child, so it's not like I even had a sibling to kind of turn to. I was really had to go inward and kind of figure out like how what is happening? What is happening? And that obviously has a huge impact on me today, just as a mom and as a wife, and it's really shaped who I am. One of my caregivers, the caregiver that has the severe mental illness, gave me permission to share some of their story.
Wow.
And I think that's what I'm most fascinated about is not just the things that happened to me as a child. It's more about understanding what was happening to my caregiver.
Mhm.
And really, what we're talking about is generational trauma in terms of my story. And when what we know about brain science is that you need two key things to build a brain. And the first thing is having a loving and supportive caregiver, and the second thing is protection from toxic stress.
Mm.
And my caregiver didn't have either of that in their childhood. I mean, my caregiver tells me that not even their teachers were supportive because they um, had a lot of disruptive behaviors, which is probably related to the trauma. So, all in all, to say this, I think a lot about how do we break these cycles and how do we not pass them down, cycles of abuse. Um, and that's really why I got into mental health. And I didn't know what the diagnosis was until I was in high school. But why the first 6 years of my life were important is because that's when, at age 6, when my parents divorced.
Mm.
And that's kind of when, you know, everything became just a little bit more stable. It was still
Mhm.
chaotic at times, but a little bit more stable.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing. I really appreciate it, and I think that um, the more I do this, just to respond selfishly, the more I do this and hear these stories, it becomes so apparent to me every time how common and how many people are out there going through this, going through trauma,
Mm.
processing now as an adult that we don't know about.
Mhm.
And it's so heavy and it impacts every
Mhm.
facet of your life. And if you if you think about just the person you're interacting with every day, not knowing, you hear all the time, like, you never know what's going on for someone. And it might
Yeah.
be that you just never know what's going on for someone that happened 20 years ago, 30 years
Yeah.
ago, whatever it
Yeah.
is. And so I really appreciate you sharing. I think we just have to continue to normalize these stories and in the sense that it's okay to talk about, right?
Right,
Not
right. And I
normalize
think
like this is okay. I didn't
right.
mean that, but
Yeah.
just the
To talk
sharing
about it,
aspect.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that there are 2 reasons why I really haven't shared it publicly, and that is, 1, protecting my family,
Mhm.
and then also 2, like, there's a lot of shame around it,
Yeah.
and, breaking shame cycles also takes a lot of effort and work and support,
Mhm.
and, you know, it just can be very tricky and very difficult. These are things that I've recently started to think about. I was telling a girlfriend today before, I hopped on this podcast that, these are things I haven't had to talk about in a really long time. And it's kind of difficult to kind of go through that process again
Yeah.
because my healing journey really didn't start until I left my childhood home and moved to a different state and then created a whole life for myself.
Wow. Okay. Okay. And do you think looking back, was that an intentional move of I need to remove myself so that I can move on, or it was just what you did to survive?
It's just what I did. It wasn't, I think that there are probably messages around me. I think one big thing, so I grew up as a tennis player. I grew up playing tennis through my entire childhood. And I really liked the idea of California and playing tennis in California. And I think more than anything, that stuck with me. And it
Mm,
was less about kind of, oh, I need to move out of this chaotic
okay.
environment to start healing. That was definitely not.
Mhm.
But when I reflect back, it said, I mean, I feel like that was the best thing that I could have done for myself was
Mhm.
to have that courage to kind of leave my home you know, I haven't moved back. I've lived in California ever since I was 18. I've now actually lived here longer than I lived in
Wow.
my home state. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, I think that that was really necessary for my journey.
Mhm. And I'm curious, just now going back a moment, you know, saying that you were left not kind of, you were left to your own devices to sort
Mhm.
of figure out what was happening. And
Mhm.
can you remember what you thought? Like what, I don't know. I'm like saying that you were left on your own to
Yeah.
figure it out. Like, can you recall back to, or even a few years later,
Yeah.
maybe in thinking about it, what you thought was happening or what, I don't know, how did you process it?
Yeah, I think as a child, you just don't have the cognitive process and the ability to really understand. So you have to frame it the way that it makes sense to you. And then
Mm,
I think what's really tricky is not personalizing it, because I think a lot of it I personalize, like this
mhm.
has to do with me. Right.
Yeah.
And that's very true in early child development in terms of cognitive development, specifically that we're very egocentric. The world revolves around us.
Mhm.
And as a child, it's I'm doing something wrong. This is because of something that I did.
Mhm.
And if anything, it kind of showed up, I think, more in my behaviors. Like I'll share this one story. Because of the chaos, the verbal abuse, witnessing physical abuse against my caregivers, experiencing physical abuse directly. Anytime the volume in the house got to a certain level, I would go to a safe place, and that safe place was a closet.
Mm,
And as a 20 something, now at this point in my life, I'm in college, like late in college. And I'm living my best college life. But, I come home for holidays. Things were starting to escalate. The volume was starting to escalate in the house. And all of a sudden, I find myself in a closet as a 20 something.
mm. Yeah.
So, that's definitely a
Yeah.
response to the childhood trauma. And that really is what that was the cue where I was like, I think I need to go to therapy. And I had been in and out of therapy my whole life, but this is when I had decided to go back.
Mhm.
So I don't know what I was thinking. I think it was more of like how I was responding in terms of my behavior.
Okay,
So
that makes
I
sense.
really went inward a
Mhm,
lot. I kept a lot of things in. I was encouraged not to share my feelings.
mhm,
I was encouraged not to speak up. So I left a lot inside, and actually I had, as a child, I thought I had stomach problems, like GI problems.
mhm,
Really, I think those were somatic symptoms related to the trauma.
mhm, mhm. Okay, so from either, birth to 6 years or at any point after that, shortly after that, are there things now looking back that you either wish or you would advise someone that you would have been interacting with outside of your home to be looking for, to be noticing, to be asking you? Um, because it strikes me as what you do now, right? There's a lot of onus on the caregiver to be the one to seek out this sort of support.
Right.
But if the caregivers are not in a position to do that, what do we tell the people around these kids to look for, to be asking? I don't know. Any thoughts on that?
I think, the children that externalize their behaviors obviously get more attention, right?
Hmm.
Because it's more disruptive in the classroom. So we're talking like outside of the home environment. And so those kids that are engaging in a lot of disruptive behavior they're really just like, they're verbally lashing out or they're getting physically aggressive with other children or other adults. Those are the kids where we say, hold up, like what's going on? And counselors and educators, I think, are better. I know that they're better, and I know that they get a lot more training
Hmm.
today around looking for red flags, signs of
Hmm.
red flags. And I think usually when those children are externalizing, there's a whole process. So teachers are starting to ask questions, or counselors are asking specific questions to kind of see how much the child's going to share about what, like, kind of what's going on at home. I think the harder children to identify are the children that internalize kind of what I was talking about, though, what was happening to me. You know, I wasn't a good student.
Hmm.
And I think part of that too is directly related to the trauma experience because when
Hmm.
you're not feeling safe, when you feel like you're being looked at or judged in a way. So part of it, like with a normal development versus like kind of the chaos that's going on at home, not doing great academically, not speaking up, having a lot of somatic symptoms in terms of internal illnesses.
Hmm.
I think those are also red flags too that we often miss.
Hmm. Hmm. How does your family feel about the career path you went down and your platforms and all that? Are they aware? Are there feelings and thoughts that you know of?
I would say my caregivers are very supportive. I think they're cheering for me, they're rooting for me. I think they think it's unconventional and they don't quite understand it. I mean, they
Mhm.
understand that I'm a therapist.
Right.
I, I don't think that they quite understand like the purpose of the podcast or,
Mhm.
the purpose of Thriving Toddler, but they understand what a therapist is, and they're in large part they're very supportive. But I grew up around Asian culture, and Asian culture, it's you can be like one of three things, and that is a lawyer, a doctor, or an accountant, and neither of which I picked.
Right.
But I think that they now appreciate it.
Yeah. And I know, just with, not that I have Asian family members, but I have Italian, I have spoken
Mhm,
with other, cultural
mhm,
backgrounds. There are also, I would guess, and you can tell me, but I think even just sharing is really can be taboo, can be, like we don't talk about what goes on behind closed doors. We protect the
mhm.
family, we protect the reputation. Why do you need a therapist? You have friends, you have, go for a walk, grab a drink. It's like,
Yeah,
I think that's totally changing now within, the
yeah.
next generations, but
Yeah.
certainly the combination of generational and cultural with a
Mhm.
very broad stroke. I'm generalizing grossly right now, but it's tough to kind of be the one to break through Well, it's cycle breaking is what it is, I guess.
Cycle breaking. It
Yeah.
really is, and it's really it's worth it, but also know that the journey is really hard.
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah.
gonna I'm not gonna, like, give a soft pillow, like, cushion
No.
on it just
Yeah.
it's not, the work is worth doing because there's nothing like having your own children where a lot of that generational trauma comes up.
Yeah.
And then it ends up showing its ugly head, and then again, that shame cycle, it's really hard to build. It's hard to break.
Yeah. In your
And
own, oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, 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 it's really challenging to kind of face it head on. And
Mm,
I think oftentimes it's a lot easier just to avoid, minimize, not think about, invalidate, right? Those are all things that we were taught. And I think you're right. I think that we're slowly evolving, and especially millennials are much more open to therapy. I see, and I see that across the board in my work, and I see them opening up. And then also the day of social media.
right.
There's so many therapists showing up on social media, sharing this information, and that I think helping to normalize it. But you're right. In previous generations, it's about keeping it within the family, right? Because of the shame. We don't talk
Hmm.
about it outside of the family.
Hmm.
They're very private, and that's very hard because they, didn't have access maybe to the knowledge that we have today.
Right. Right. Okay. And now, so you have two kids.
I do.
Um, in, you know, not a secret, right, that our past shows up when
Yeah.
we become parents.
Yeah.
For you, are there particular like ways that your childhood, your past trauma has manifested in your mothering? Like, do you have to
Mhm.
check yourself in certain ways? Has
Mhm.
anything surprised you about what's your maybe natural reaction to things, or what comes to mind for you after I say all of those things?
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I've got all of these awesome skills, right? Like, and I use them. I use them. And then what ends up happening is they don't always work, which I don't
Mhm.
expect them to. Like I know better. But that what ends up happening where this trauma kind of comes up for me, and then I like have to take a step back and I have to actively work on it, is for me is I get quickly overstimulated.
Mm,
Like my senses are quickly like my brain is like so overwhelmed, and I just want my kids to listen the first time I ask them to do something.
yeah.
And then that's when I'm more likely to lash out, meaning like yell, like,
Yeah.
I've already asked you like 3 times, it's time to do this. Like I fall into the same traps.
You react. Yeah.
I react, right. And
Mhm.
so it has been, I have a 2.5-year-old and a 5-year-old now, and I
Mhm.
have to actively I put behavioral systems in place for my children, but for me, so we have systems like stop, think, choose, where my daughter, she's older, so it applies to her. We when we're feeling angry, so we've got this beautiful picture of this kid like screaming, right? And right below it is when you feel angry, you stop with the big stop sign. And then below that, you think. And then below that is you have choice A or choice B. Choice
Mm,
A is I can use a breathing exercise, a coping exercise. I could walk away and say I'm not ready. And B is a B choice, which is less preferred. And that is I'm going to yell or I'm going to do something like throw, in
mhm.
my child's instance. And then, when they use it, we also pair it with a token economy system in the house. So, like, I put all of these great behavioral interventions in place, not just for my children, but for myself. So they're holding me accountable as well. Well, my daughter is, my 2.5-year-old is too young, but my daughter's also holding me accountable, right? She's like, "Oh, mom, you're raising your voice. It's scaring me." I was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry." I acknowledge it. And then I go and take a token away
Mm,
from my jar. So, it's a work in process, and I have no problems having her check my behavior because I'm giving her the space to say, "Mom, your voice is scaring me." And then that quickly disarms me. That
mm,
I'm snapping out of my like reptilian brain,
mhm,
right? And I'm going into my frontal lobe and I'm saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, like this, I'm taking, like, this is too scary for her."
mhm.
Like, and raising my voice could be like, "Remember what I said?" Right? It could just that influx, and she's like, I don't like that."
Or like bat signals going off.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not to say, like, you need to be monotone about everything, like,
Right.
normal, like, conversation has different intonations and tones and everything.
Mhm.
Um, but it's just, it prevents me from taking it to a place that becomes scary for her.
Yeah. It's a checkpoint. It's a check and balance. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have kids the exact same age, and it's so
Yeah.
hard. It's so
It's so hard.
hard. It's
It's
oh, my brain
and
just
I think
hurts
really,
thinking
like,
about it.
I've seen on social media, people have said like yelling is the new spanking, right? Because we know there's lots of literature on corporal punishment, and, we don't spank, and we definitely don't. I was spanked, but we
Mhm.
don't spank in my house.
Right.
So then people feel, or parents often feel like, well, I have nothing in my arsenal but to yell, because that's the only thing that gets them to listen. And
Yeah.
so we kind of are stuck in these patterns. But, that creates a fear response in them, and that creates a physiological response.
Yeah.
Like, I happen to know my son has a stronger response, like physiological, like I see it in his body, like he
Mm,
flinches when he's scared of like Halloween stuff, right?
mm,
Anything that induces fear. Whereas my daughter's just much more mellow, and she can kind of let things kind of roll off of her shoulder a little bit more.
mhm,
But,
mhm.
even being aware as a parent of their differences and their responding, I think is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna go down that road in a moment. But I want to take you back one more time, um, to the only child. You
Oh
are an
yeah,
only child.
as an only child.
I had
Yep.
a conversation with a friend recently who was sharing how, thinking about starting her family, and she was just sharing that she's an only child, and it occurs to her that, her kids. She's like, "Who are my kids' cousins? No one." And so is her partner. He's also an only child.
Mhm.
And she's like, and just that feeling of having people around you other than my parents, or God forbid, like, the day that my parents are no longer around.
Yeah.
She's like, who are the drop everything people in my life? And of course I'm like, I'll be your drop everything person, you
Yeah.
know, but
Yeah.
it was something that I have half siblings. And my husband has 2 brothers that we're very close with, and so it's like, on one hand, I was like, "I kinda get you, but I can't fully get it." And so I wonder, just what your take on how that's impacted you being an only child beyond sort of your childhood, and not having someone in the moment, but beyond now.
Yeah, I want to say, I'm a very solution focused individual. Like, that doesn't mean like you can't validate, your experience, but like for your friend specifically, I think that, she doesn't have any control
Yeah.
over the
No,
fact that
I
she
know.
doesn't have,
I
a
know.
sibling, and there are going to be no cousins around. And so I think really like that fact, that variable isn't going to change, right?
Mhm,
And so I think spending a lot of time there may not be as productive as one might think.
mhm,
And so really focusing on, the friends, like the good people around you, being really careful about who you bring into your circle that can be the drop everything people. And I think really focusing on building those relationships and having that is everything.
yeah.
Um, so those are still social connections. For me, I had a lot of cousins, right? So because
Mm,
my entire family immigrated to the United States when I was young, and so all of us cousins had each other. I have like 7 cousins.
mhm,
There's 7 of us, and so we were all kind of like close in proximity.
mhm,
And I was one of the oldest.
mhm,
So, I had my cousins, and then when it came time for me to but really I had my friends.
yeah,
I had just all I needed was one good friend to feel
mhm,
connected with, and they changed throughout my childhood, but I always had that one person that I could go to.
mhm,
And then as a parent now, I struggled with, do I want one child? Do I want 2 children? And, for me, ultimately, when talking to my husband, we had decided that we wanted multiple children. And that was the best decision for
yeah,
me.
yeah,
And I'm happy that we did that. And although it's very, very hard on us, at this stage in development, like
uh-huh,
it's exhausting.
yeah. Yeah. My, daughter had me up 3 times last night.
Yeah. 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 That'll stabilize somewhere around age 6. So just
Oh,
hold
thank
out
God.
till 6.
Oh my God, I know. But yeah, no, I feel you. And it's interesting. Like I said, I have siblings. They're older though. I didn't grow up
Yeah.
with anyone. I grew up with this friend actually, but
Mhm.
there was no one in my house every day as a
Yeah.
sibling the way I see my kids. And so that's
Mhm.
so interesting for me because I look at them and I'm like, I really can't relate to this experience at all. I
For
know what
sure.
you're doing is normal, but like, whoa, I
I
like didn't want
know.
anyone in my stuff. I didn't want anyone talking to me.
It's
Like,
true.
yeah.
But, they and that's I had the same thoughts too, and, like, part of me, like, when I look at, like, the information that we do know about, only children, I look at myself and I was like, "Yeah, I do identify, a lot with the fact that, like, it's hard for me to share certain things. I wanna
Hmm.
keep things close to me." Um, yeah, those my husband likes to give me a hard time about being an only child, but the beauty of only children is they get all of their parents' resources, right?
Mm,
Because it's one child versus
yes.
dividing your attention, dividing your finances, dividing whatever it may be, between multiple children.
Yeah,
And not to say that that's a negative thing, but that is one of the upsides of
totally.
having being an only child.
Yeah. Yeah, and then I guess my next thought is kind of the flip of that is the kinda trope going around in social media that we're seeing a lot right now is about being the oldest daughter or being the only daughter and,
Mhm.
bearing the weight of the family in a sense, like
Mhm.
completely caretaking for the parents when they get a certain age, taking care if there are younger siblings, kind of being the emotional container for them and
Yep.
all of that. Do you identify with aspects of being like the only daughter and all of the kind of like emotional implications that come with that?
Honestly, not yet. I think it's one of those things that I don't have to think about because we're very verbal in my family about the plan, right?
Okay.
So, like,
Okay.
we know the plan and we just have to be able I just have to be able to execute that plan when it comes.
Got it.
So I don't it's not something like it's energy of worry, like the worry in the form of energy
Mm,
that, like, I don't need to think about it right now,
yeah.
right? So it's not
Fair.
relevant. I need as much brain space as I can
I
for
know.
all the things I need to do right now.
I know. I know. I know. Okay. All right. So let's go to what you do a little bit more. There are quite a few mentions throughout your website, your social media about what you do as being, science based, like that
Yeah.
phrasing of science based. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and how maybe that differs from some other parenting strategies and philosophies we see out there?
Yeah, yeah, and science is great, right? It's great because it gives us a lot of information. It's about creating structure and designs, and it gives us more information, right? It's like it's important in terms of making these decisions.
Hmm.
And as a clinician, when I'm treating a a specific mental disorder, it would be unethical for me to treat someone when we know that there's evidence of this intervention really supporting this deficit or disorder
Okay.
versus I'm going to do this willy-nilly thing over here that says, okay, like, if I change just as an example, like, if I change my child's diet, this is going to totally change my child's behavior, right? Like,
Okay.
there's no evidence to really support that the two have a relationship. And so, therefore, as a clinician, I'm not going to suggest that a family does that because I don't have any proof or support behind the fact that this is actually going to create better outcomes, right? And ultimately, when parents are coming to me, they're really struggling,
Hmm.
really, really struggling. And as a struggling parent, what do you want? You want that person's knowledge and you want to know that something's going to work,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So I think there's a lot that we know from science, and there's still a lot that we don't know. And so, in terms of parenting and child development, there are these evidence-based treatments. There's like 5 of them. And all of them, what they have in common are behavioral interventions
Okay.
because we know behavioral interventions work.
Mm.
Um, a really popular book right now that's out that I personally have read cover to cover that I think is excellent is Atomic Habits.
Mm.
And that book is behavioral sciences to a T. So he's saying, right, James Clear, I think is it James Clear? Okay.
Something like that. It
He's
sounds right.
saying that, yeah, don't quote me on that. You might have to put in the show notes who the real author is. But, when we're talking about changing our habits,
You had it right.
we're really talking about behavioral intervention.
Okay.
And so the same is true when we're working with our children. And I'm not saying behavioral intervention is for all children, right? There's children that have severe trauma histories where that might not be the treatment of choice, right?
Okay.
So it's really important that the clinician, I mean, most clinicians that are trained are going to know like what the behavioral or what the treatment of choice is. I want to make sure that that I'm behaving in an ethical way. And so where social media gets a little scary for me is that you have people that call themselves parenting experts or parenting coaches, people that were just have a really like big enthusiasm for child development, but don't really necessarily have the education, the clinical experience to really say like this, it's just an opinion. It's not a
Yeah.
fact.
Okay.
And I think for parents today, it's what is opinion, what is based in science, and like, how do I interpret this and use this in my home? And so for me, it's an ethical duty to say, well, this is what we know about the science, and this is what we know works in terms of increasing compliance, for example, and using it in a responsible way. Now, the other side that I struggle with social media for my account, Thriving Toddler, is that there are so many nuances in human behavior. So I may talk about a timeout procedure, but without knowing all of the facts of your personal situation, it's really hard to say, like, I think a timeout procedure would be appropriate.
Right.
There are so many nuances and so many other things to consider before I would even recommend such a thing. But we do know through decades of research that timeout from positive reinforcement, when done appropriately, is effective. But I don't know if parents also know, what does it really look like? How is it really implemented? And what other procedures should I consider first? And so those are the questions that having a trained professional help answer can go a long way in making you feel good about the decisions that you're making.
Okay. So why don't you talk about that a minute? Because I think that timeouts are pretty controversial at this point.
Yeah.
Nope, there aren't a lot of people out there advocating for it. And then you have the whole other side of the people that get in those people's comment section, like, I
Yeah.
got timeouts and I turned out okay, like all that.
Yeah.
Why
Just
don't
like
you
a
just,
spanking. I got spanked and I turned
yeah,
out
I'm
okay.
fine. Um,
Yeah.
why don't you talk about that a minute? About the how you see a timeout in the best way
So
possible
there
in the
are
shortest
actually,
amount of time without
yeah,
knowing everyone's specific information.
yeah, no, timeout really could be its own. I talk a lot about timeout from positive reinforcement. That's what it's called in the literature, in the science.
Okay.
And I think the history of timeout really came out of spanking, people moving away from corporal punishment and using alternative parenting strategies. And then now it's evolved, right? So really the controversy over the timeout happened when two big names in our field in the parenting space came out and said, like, hey, like, let's not use timeouts anymore. They're damaging. And I think that when done inappropriately, they can be. And when I say inappropriately, it's the parent's upset, the parent's angry, yells at their kid, sends them to their room and shuts the door and lets them like cry it out by themselves. Right. I think that that's one version of what a timeout looks like. Well, that's actually that's it could be inappropriate because, like, let's say that child's tantruming because they didn't want to do some kind of chore or they didn't want to complete some kind of task that you requested. Well, that actually sending them to the room actually reinforces the behavior. It reinforces the tantrum. And so just because your child has a tantrum or your child, is hitting and you automatically send them to a timeout, that punishment procedure is actually not effective. So
Mm.
you're just like going through the motions and it's not really doing anything to change the behavior. And that's a problem in general with only using punishment,
Okay.
is that you're never teaching the appropriate behaviors. And so before you even use a punishment procedure that's appropriate, so things like a verbal reprimand, things like a timeout, you have to exhaust all of your positive, proactive, and teaching strategies before you incorporate a timeout procedure. And even if you decide to do that, you need to have all of the other pieces in place for it to be effective.
Okay.
So timeout is actually really effective. Like at recess, envision your kids at recess, and let's say like they aggressively push a child down the slide. That's an unsafe behavior, and that could potentially warrant a timeout, meaning the child has to go sit on the bench for a couple minutes. So if that child is then missing out on their playtime, and in the future, let's say the next day, they're less likely to push, then that timeout was effective.
Okay.
So I think that when I talk about nuances, you have to and parents don't have access to all of those nuances.
Right.
So I think that that's the trouble with social media, is you get these bite-sized informations and you don't really get the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
When you're consistently leaving your child alone emotionally, sending them to their room, not talking about their emotions or not problem solving, over time, then yes, what is the message that you're sending? That like when I'm
Doesn't matter.
angry or when you do
Yeah.
something wrong, like I don't want to connect with you anymore. And sure, that probably does damage the parent-child relationship to some degree. And I agree with that. What I don't agree with is just using a blanket statement saying don't use timeout from positive reinforcement. I think that is a disservice to parents, because then parents then feel like they can't use any form of punishment.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to clarify that punishment means like a verbal reprimand, saying no, don't run across the street.
Right.
If that works, that's technically punishment, meaning it decreases the behavior. So I think it's just using the terminology appropriately, and then knowing how to appropriately implement, I think goes a long way, because I think with social media now, it's don't use consequences, don't use timeouts, don't do this, don't do that. And the parents are like, well, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah. Yeah.
What do I have in my toolbox?
Yeah. Yeah. It feels like like I don't know. It just feels.
And
It
I'm
feels
not
like
saying
I.
you
Yeah.
have
Yeah.
I'm
Go
not
ahead.
saying you have to use timeout. That's not my argument. The
I know you're
argument
not. Yeah.
is, do you really know what a timeout procedure really looks like? If it doesn't fit your family values and that's not something you want to use, that's totally okay. My
Yeah.
job as a clinician is to say, okay, then let's try these other strategies first.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I created my back pocket essentials for parents that don't really want to use kind of the timeout. Then you can exhaust all of your positive, proactive teaching strategies, and all of that is in the back pocket. My favorite ones are in my back pocket essentials.
Okay. And I think this is also a good time to mention that you do have quite a few paid and unpaid resources on your website and a podcast that is going to deep dive all the things that I'm not going to have time to do today. So,
Correct. Yes.
for the actual parenting strategies and parenting ideas and advice, we're going to seek out your podcast and your website and your social media. And we're going to know that it comes with a grain of salt that Michelle is not in your house. She's not in your living room. These are
Not,
just what she's learned over the course of her training and experience as a mom.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to provide education, but at the end of the day, it really, like, there are nuances that you want people to be aware of before you make recommendations,
Mm-hmm.
because we don't come with a manual,
Mm-hmm.
we just don't.
Okay. So, what do you think, though, if you could summarize, like, do you have like an overall kind of elevator pitch for the type of parenting that you, I don't know, believe in?
I don't know. That's a good question. No, I don't have an elevator pitch. I take the science,
Mm-hmm.
I take the nuance, I take emotional intelligence. I think that's often left out in behaviorism in general,
Mm-hmm.
because that's
And
what behaviorists,
do you mean on the part of the parent or the child or both?
both,
Yeah. Okay.
both, both. You know, I think that's often left out in behavioral analysis and it is because it's mentalistic, meaning it's inside. It's not observable. You can't see it, but
Mhm.
obviously you can show emotion and
Yes.
see that. But I think talking about emotions, talking about nuances, talking about behaviors and how they all mesh together and they work together and making sure you have that secure attachment, loving relationships, all of that is really important and that protection from toxic stress. And so, yeah, that's not a good elevator pitch.
No, but
But I
I
think
yeah, but it's your truth though. I mean, it's what you do.
it's a decade and a half of clinical work and experience and saying, even to the non-clinical, like non-clinical needs, meaning your child doesn't have a mental disorder, you don't have a mental disorder, but just saying like we can parent better, right? Like when we're talking about generational trauma,
Yeah.
we can parent better, and you can use all of these great tools that have been researched and studied over and over and over again and continue to show up in the data as being effective that are in these 5 evidence-based parenting strategies
Uh-huh. Okay.
or yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So, um, remind me, when you say 5 evidence-based strategies, is the behavioral intervention, are there 5 of them, or is behavioral intervention one of the 5?
No, behavioral intervention is incorporated in all 5 of these programs. So things like the incredible years, right? Or the other, I can't name all 5, but
Okay.
incredible years is one of the evidence-based parenting supports. So like think of like
Oh, I follow what you're saying
children,
now. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
that
okay.
go
Go ahead.
into foster systems
Mhm.
or that are adopted. Those parents often have to go through these programs and they're often taught those one of the 5, right,
Okay.
parenting interventions to support the child.
Got it. Okay. I understand now. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Is there anything that, considering you have likely a bunch of moms listening to this, anything that you wish more parents maybe understood about toddlers that we get wrong, or anything you commonly see that you're like, gosh, this came up again. I wish more parents, knew this about their kids or knew this about parenting, or something that maybe we
Yeah.
mistake a lot.
Oh, that's a good question. I want moms to know that I know that you're out there doing the very best that you can. And I think you should always acknowledge that. And I don't think that you should beat yourself up when just have a lot of self-compassion and self-love, because when you do that, then you give that gift to your children as well.
Mhm.
So don't be too hard on yourself. The other thing when it comes to toddler tantrums, because they're very common, is number one, do not take it personally. It's not about you,
Mm.
period, end of story. They're not doing it to manipulate you. They're not throwing a tantrum to get their way,
Yeah.
right? And I'm talking about the age group between 1 and 4.
Right.
Okay. So that's number one. Number two is don't try to reason, don't try to fix, let them work through the tantrum and provide those teaching opportunities after, like later on, right? During your play, during your downtime, when they're happy. And when I talk about teaching, like anything can set your toddler off, right? Anything. It could be anything.
The wrong color spoon this morning.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Or like you asked for this spoon, but then I gave it to you and then you cried and you want a different spoon.
mhm, mhm, mhm.
Right? Like those are all common
Yep.
universal things that toddlers do. So don't take it personally, work through it, provide choices, provide lots of opportunities to learn outside of the tantruming event. And then the last thing I really want parents to do is really be aware of what are your own coping strategies and how
Mm,
do you show them in the home?
mhm,
Most of them are probably maladaptive,
mhm,
and that's okay. But that would be the best. One of the best gifts I think you could give your children is modeling, like labeling your own emotions, modeling that you are having a hard time, and then modeling that deep, relaxing breath,
mhm,
right? So I think that's another thing I would love in terms of having parents do more.
mhm.
I know that I try to practice that.
Yeah,
I don't always get it right,
yeah,
but I certainly try. So I think there's a lot more than one,
yeah.
but I
Yeah,
would
no,
say all those pieces together are really important in the toddler years. They
yeah.
set a solid foundation for emotional intelligence as they enter middle childhood, and it's really going to be important as they enter the teen years.
Hmm. I think just hearing you say all those things, like, I think what I really struggle with is, and I don't know that it's often talked about, is like the response to those things, like modeling or just sitting with your
Mhm.
kid in the pain and the
Yeah,
frustration, is that the response you get is still going to look like F off. It's still going to look like I'm not listening to you. And I feel like that is so hard in the 1 to 4, is you're doing this almost like we were talking about in the beginning of the black hole. It's like,
yeah,
hello, are
yeah.
you seeing me do my breathing exercises? you
Right.
know, Again, I think too, I think maybe it's just also the millennial in me of like wanting the instant gratification, wanting the
Yeah,
response, wanting it's
yeah.
almost like I want my kid to hit the like button on my breathing exercises,
Right.
and they're
It just
not. They don't
You gotta
care.
do it 20, 50, 100 times before. I introduced Stop, Think, Choose at the age of 3.5, and my daughter is now 5.
Mhm.
And now she's coming home saying, Mommy, today I did Stop, Think, Choose. And I was like, what? I didn't even realize like that really stuck out to you. So just that's an example of they are listening, and that just because it doesn't work doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep doing it if it's something that's important to you. So like I like the stop, think, choose. And so like I talk about it. And my son, who's 2.5, does not care, but at least it's around him.
It's on
He's
the brain
indirectly
waves.
observing
Yeah.
it. Maybe I hope like he needs it more than she does at this point. But
Yeah.
maybe I hope that like through osmosis, he'll do it. And if not, then I can directly teach to that. I think parents that feel empowered to know that they do have control over their behaviors that'll directly impact their children. You can't control your children, but you control the environment that they live in,
Mhm.
then outcomes are better. And research does show that.
Mhm.
That flexibility in thinking that parents have, that they do have control over their child's environment and can create positive situations for them, have overall positive outcomes in their life.
Mhm. Okay. All right. I know that I could go down 35 other rabbit holes with you, and but I'm going to respect your time here. Is there anything based on what you shared about your own story, anything about the work you do that is still kind of lingering on your heart, mind, or soul that you want to make sure to say here or just leave people with?
That I was vulnerable today, that this is the first time that I've really talked openly and publicly about my family history. And I'm really nervous about it. And I don't know who will listen to it, but I hope that it will positively impact somebody out there, like I mentioned before. And that just know that it's easier to go down the path, the healing path with other people that you know, love, and trust, than doing it yourself.
Mhm. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing and for being here. And I'll say it again, if anyone is actually looking for more of Michelle's parenting, ideas, please check out, her website. I will link everything, including the podcast, in the show notes. And again, just thank you so much for sharing here today. And I really appreciate you.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And before we sign off, I just want to say I know we talked a lot about toddler behaviors,
Yes.
but I also, in my practice, specialize in postpartum mood disorders.
Oh, perfect.
So, moms that are feeling a little bit more anxious or depressed in their postpartum period. So, if you live in the state of California and you feel like I would be a good fit for you, please send me a DM, and we could determine if we're a good fit for each other.
Perfect. And I also have a place on my website where I will put your practice information. So I'll get that from you off air. But anyway, thank you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, first and foremost, I have to say a big thank you to Michelle. Your bravery, your honesty, I so appreciate you. My listeners appreciate you. And I encourage any of you listening to reach out to Michelle if her story made any kind of impact on you. She mentioned it, and we've talked a lot about this on the show, that it's not easy to talk about our past, especially when it involves trauma. And especially when you know that it's going to be made public. So Michelle shared her story to help, even if it was just one person. And I can tell you, as someone who regularly puts her story out there for people to hear, that there is nothing more comforting than to actually hear directly from someone who heard the story and related to it. So again, please don't hesitate to reach out to her, follow her accounts, listen to her podcast. And again, just thank you, Michelle, for honoring me and my show with your story. And speaking of her accounts and her podcast, if you have a toddler, will have a toddler soon, are thinking about having a kid, which will eventually turn into a toddler, go to all of her bodies of work. Just go right now, click over to her Instagram or her podcast and follow, subscribe. Her philosophies and advice are beautifully presented, clear, concise, and of course, science-based. She is also a toddler mom herself, which we know, so she really gets it. She gets it from the clinical point of view, the scientific point of view, and as the mom with boots on the ground point of view. And there is just something so wonderfully relatable about her and what she shares. So thank you again so much, Michelle, for your time and for sharing your expertise and your story with us. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Sass Says is a production of Luann Nigara, Inc. This podcast is meant to be educational and not meant to replace professional therapy or professional medical attention. To learn more about today's show and what's new in my world, head over to sasssays.com. Thanks so much. Talk later.